The year is 138 BCE, and a young Chinese diplomat named Zhang Qian stands at the edge of the known world, staring into an endless expanse of desert that stretches beyond the horizon like a golden ocean frozen in time. He carries with him the mandate of Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, a mission that will inadvertently birth the greatest trade network in human history. Zhang Qian doesn't know it yet, but his footsteps across these shifting sands will echo through the centuries, connecting civilizations that had never dreamed of each other's existence. What began as a desperate military alliance would become something far more profound. The Silk Road wasn't built in a day, nor was it the product of a single empire's ambition. Instead, it emerged like a river system, with countless tributaries flowing together to create a massive current of commerce, culture, and human connection that would reshape the ancient world. From the bustling markets of Chang'an to the marble columns of Constantinople, from the spice gardens of Samarkand to the workshops of Damascus, this network of routes would carry more than just goods across continents. Tonight, we're going to trace every footstep, every camel caravan, every diplomatic mission, and every merchant's gamble that transformed isolated kingdoms into a connected world. We'll witness the rise and fall of empires, follow the paths of monks and missionaries, and discover how a simple desire for Chinese silk would ultimately change the course of human civilization forever. But our story doesn't begin with Zhang Qian's historic mission. To understand how the Silk Road came to exist, we must first journey back even further to the origins of the civilizations that would eventually reach across the void to find each other. The roots of transcontinental trade stretch back thousands of years before the first silk merchant ever crossed the Taklamakan Desert. In the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, along the banks of the Nile, and in the river systems of ancient China, human societies were developing the surplus production and technological sophistication necessary to support long-distance commerce. These early civilizations possessed unique resources and innovations that would eventually create the economic incentives for the most ambitious trade network the ancient world had ever seen. In China during the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, artisans had already mastered the delicate art of silk production, a process so closely guarded that revealing its secrets to foreigners was punishable by death. The lustrous fabric, lighter than cotton yet stronger than wool, would become more valuable than gold in distant markets that had never seen its like. Meanwhile, Chinese craftsmen were perfecting techniques for working jade, bronze, and later iron, creating goods that would prove irresistible to foreign buyers who encountered them. Far to the west, the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt were developing their own specialties that would eventually flow eastward along the trade routes. Egyptian artisans created intricate glass vessels and jewelry that showcased techniques unknown in other parts of the world. Mesopotamian cities became centers for the production of fine textiles, metalwork, and the cultivation of exotic spices and incense that grew nowhere else on earth. The Phoenicians, those master seafarers of the ancient Mediterranean, were establishing trading posts across the known world and developing the commercial networks that would eventually connect with overland routes from Asia. Between these distant civilizations lay vast expanses of territory, controlled by nomadic peoples who would play a crucial role in the development of intercontinental trade. The steppes of Central Asia, those endless grasslands that stretched from the Black Sea to Mongolia, were home to horse-riding tribes whose mobility and knowledge of the terrain made them natural intermediaries for long-distance commerce. These nomadic confederations, including the Scythians, Parthians, and various Turkic peoples, possessed the skills and geographic knowledge necessary to navigate the treacherous routes across mountains and deserts. The technological foundations for long-distance trade were also taking shape during these early periods. The domestication of the Bactrian camel around 3000 BCE provided the key to crossing the Central Asian deserts, as these remarkable animals could carry heavy loads across waterless terrain for days at a time. The development of advanced metallurgy allowed for the creation of tools and weapons that could survive the rigors of transcontinental travel, while improvements in navigation and map-making made it possible to plan and execute journeys across previously unknown territories. But technology and resources alone were not sufficient to create the Silk Road. What was needed was the political and economic pressure that would drive civilizations to reach beyond their borders in search of new markets and strategic alliances. That pressure would come from the rise of one of history's most formidable nomadic confederations, the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu emerged as a dominant force on the northern borders of China during the 3rd century BCE, just as the Qin dynasty was unifying the Chinese kingdoms under a single imperial rule. These skilled horsemen and archers had organized themselves into a sophisticated confederation that could field armies of hundreds of thousands of warriors, posing an existential threat to Chinese civilization. The Xiongnu's mastery of cavalry warfare and their intimate knowledge of the steppes made them nearly impossible for Chinese armies to defeat in open battle. The Chinese response to the Xiongnu threat would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in human history. Rather than simply building walls and hoping for the best, Emperor Wu of the Han dynasty conceived of a more ambitious strategy: the formation of military alliances with peoples beyond the Xiongnu territories. This required sending diplomatic missions across thousands of miles of hostile territory to make contact with civilizations that existed only in rumors and legends. Zhang Qian's mission represented the first systematic Chinese attempt to establish contact with the peoples of Central Asia and beyond. The young diplomat was tasked with reaching the Yuezhi, a nomadic confederation that had been driven westward by Xiongnu expansion and was believed to harbor deep resentment against their former enemies. If Zhang Qian could convince the Yuezhi to coordinate military actions against the Xiongnu, the Chinese could potentially crush their enemies between two armies. The journey that Zhang Qian undertook in 138 BCE would have challenged even the most experienced explorers. His route led him directly through Xiongnu territory, where capture meant certain death, or, if he was fortunate, years of captivity. The diplomatic mission carried gifts intended to demonstrate Chinese wealth and technological sophistication, including silk textiles, bronze mirrors, and lacquerware that showcased the finest products of Chinese craftsmanship. Zhang Qian's luck ran out almost immediately. Within days of departing Chinese territory, his entire diplomatic convoy was captured by Xiongnu patrols. For the next 10 years, Zhang Qian lived as a prisoner among the nomads, forced to witness firsthand the military capabilities and political organization of China's greatest enemies. But this captivity also provided him with invaluable knowledge about the peoples and territories beyond China's borders, information that would prove crucial when he finally managed to escape and continue his mission. When Zhang Qian finally broke free from Xiongnu captivity around 128 BCE, he found himself in a world that exceeded even his wildest expectations. The territories beyond the desert were home to sophisticated urban civilizations that possessed technologies, artistic traditions, and commercial networks that rivaled those of China itself. The cities of the Fergana Valley amazed him with their advanced irrigation systems and their famous heavenly horses, animals so superior to Chinese breeds that they would become objects of imperial obsession. In Bactria, Zhang Qian encountered Greek kingdoms established by the successors of Alexander the Great's conquests, where Hellenistic culture had blended with local traditions to create unique hybrid civilizations. These Greco-Bactrian kingdoms possessed extensive trade networks that connected them to India, Persia, and the Mediterranean world, offering tantalizing glimpses of the vast commercial possibilities that awaited Chinese merchants who could navigate these distant routes. But perhaps most significantly, Zhang Qian discovered that Chinese goods were already circulating in these distant markets, having reached Central Asia through indirect trade networks that operated without any official Chinese involvement. Silk textiles, in particular, were prized throughout the region, commanding prices that astounded even Zhang Qian's experienced diplomatic eye. The demand for Chinese luxury goods was so intense that local merchants were willing to organize dangerous expeditions across thousands of miles of hostile territory to obtain them. Zhang Qian's reports to Emperor Wu upon his return to China in 126 BCE painted a picture of unprecedented commercial and strategic opportunities. The diplomat described wealthy kingdoms eager to establish trade relationships with China, vast deposits of precious metals and gems, exotic products unknown in Chinese markets, and most importantly, the possibility of outflanking the Xiongnu through alliances with their Western neighbors. The emperor's response was swift and decisive. Rather than merely pursuing military alliances, Wu recognized that the establishment of regular trade relationships could serve multiple strategic purposes simultaneously. Commercial ties would provide China with access to valuable foreign goods and raw materials, generate substantial tax revenues for the imperial treasury, and create diplomatic relationships that could be leveraged for military purposes when necessary. The imperial court began organizing systematic expeditions to establish permanent trade relationships with the kingdoms that Zhang Qian had discovered. These missions combined diplomatic, commercial, and military elements, carrying substantial quantities of Chinese luxury goods to demonstrate the wealth and technological sophistication of the Han Empire, while also gathering intelligence about potential military threats and opportunities. The Chinese approach to developing these trade relationships reflected a sophisticated understanding of both commercial and diplomatic principles. Rather than simply dumping goods on foreign markets, Chinese officials worked to establish long-term relationships based on mutual benefit and regular exchange. They provided technical assistance to help foreign partners improve their own production capabilities, shared agricultural and manufacturing innovations, and created credit systems that allowed for large-scale commercial transactions across vast distances. The success of these early diplomatic and commercial initiatives exceeded even Emperor Wu's optimistic expectations. Within a generation, Chinese silk was being worn by Roman senators, Central Asian horses were prancing in Chinese imperial stables, and Persian carpets were gracing Chinese palaces. The flow of goods generated enormous tax revenues for the Chinese treasury, while providing access to military technologies and exotic products that enhanced the empire's prestige and power. But the establishment of regular trade relationships also created new challenges and opportunities that would shape the development of the Silk Road for centuries to come. The concentration of valuable goods in transit created irresistible targets for bandits and nomadic raiders, requiring the development of new security arrangements and military protocols. The complexity of managing commercial relationships across multiple kingdoms and cultural groups demanded innovations in banking, credit, and commercial law that would influence economic development throughout Eurasia. The early success of Chinese initiatives also attracted the attention of other major powers, who recognized the strategic and economic potential of transcontinental trade. The Parthian Empire, which controlled much of modern-day Iran and served as a crucial link between Central Asia and the Mediterranean world, began developing its own policies for managing and profiting from the growing trade flows. The Parthian Empire's entry into the transcontinental trade game would fundamentally alter the dynamics of what was becoming a truly global commercial network. Under the rule of Mithridates I and his successors, Parthia had transformed itself from a relatively minor kingdom into a major imperial power that controlled the crucial territories between the Roman world and the emerging Chinese trade routes. The Parthians possessed something that neither the Chinese nor the Romans could replicate: intimate knowledge of the vast territories that lay between the great empires of East and West. Parthian merchants and officials quickly recognized that their geographic position provided them with unprecedented opportunities to profit from the growing demand for exotic goods in both directions. Chinese silk commanded astronomical prices in Roman markets, while Roman glassware, precious metals, and luxury textiles were equally prized in Chinese cities. The Parthians positioned themselves as the essential middlemen in this exchange, establishing trading posts, rest stations, and commercial centers throughout their territories. The Parthian approach to managing transcontinental trade differed significantly from Chinese methods. Where the Chinese emphasized official diplomatic missions and state-sponsored expeditions, the Parthians developed a more decentralized system that relied heavily on private merchants and commercial partnerships. Parthian rulers provided security and infrastructure while allowing independent traders to organize their own expeditions and commercial relationships. This system proved remarkably effective at generating wealth and fostering innovation. Parthian cities like Ctesiphon and Ecbatana became cosmopolitan centers where merchants from dozens of different cultures gathered to exchange goods, information, and techniques. These urban centers developed sophisticated banking systems, standardized weights and measures, and commercial laws that facilitated transactions between parties who spoke different languages and operated under different cultural assumptions. The Parthian model also encouraged technological innovation and cultural exchange in ways that purely state-controlled systems might not have achieved. Independent merchants had strong incentives to develop more efficient transportation methods, better preservation techniques for perishable goods, and improved communication systems that could coordinate activities across vast distances. The competitive nature of private commerce drove continuous improvements in everything from camel breeding to navigation techniques. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire was experiencing its own transformation as goods from the distant East began appearing in Mediterranean markets. Roman aristocrats developed an insatiable appetite for Chinese silk, which became a symbol of wealth and sophistication that could not be replicated by any domestic industry. The lightweight, lustrous fabric was perfect for the warm Mediterranean climate and provided a level of luxury that exceeded anything produced in Roman workshops. But Roman demand extended far beyond silk to encompass a vast array of exotic products from across Asia. Spices from India and Southeast Asia revolutionized Roman cuisine, introducing flavors and preservation techniques that had been unknown in European cooking. Precious stones from Central Asia became essential elements in Roman jewelry and decorative arts, while exotic animals from the far reaches of Asia provided entertainment in Roman amphitheaters and private collections. The Roman response to these new commercial opportunities reflected the empire's characteristic combination of military organization and commercial pragmatism. Roman merchants and officials worked to establish direct trade relationships that would bypass Parthian middlemen and maximize Roman profits from the Eastern trade. This required developing new routes across the Eastern Mediterranean and establishing commercial partnerships with peoples who had previously been beyond the reach of Roman influence. Roman engineering capabilities proved particularly valuable in developing the infrastructure necessary for large-scale transcontinental trade. Roman road-building techniques, developed originally for military purposes, could be adapted to create commercial highways that connected distant trading centers. Roman architectural innovations made it possible to construct warehouses, rest stations, and commercial facilities that could handle the massive quantities of goods flowing along the trade routes. The Romans also brought to the transcontinental trade network their advanced financial and legal systems, which had been developed to manage the complex economic relationships within their far-flung empire. Roman commercial law provided frameworks for resolving disputes between merchants from different cultures, while Roman banking techniques made it possible to transfer large sums of money across vast distances, without the risks associated with carrying physical currency. As the 1st century CE progressed, the various trade routes that connected China, Central Asia, Persia, and the Roman world began to coalesce into a coherent network that merchants and officials started to recognize as a unified system. This network, which would later be known as the Silk Road, represented far more than just a series of commercial pathways. It had become a circulatory system for the ancient world, carrying not only goods, but also ideas, technologies, religious beliefs, and cultural practices across continents, The establishment of regular commercial relationships between distant civilizations created new forms of cultural exchange that would profoundly influence the development of art, science, and philosophy throughout Eurasia. Chinese artistic techniques began appearing in Roman decorative arts, while Greco-Roman sculptural traditions influenced artistic development in Central Asian kingdoms. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge developed in one part of the network quickly spread to other regions, accelerating scientific progress throughout the connected world. Religious and philosophical ideas traveled even more rapidly than commercial goods along the emerging trade routes. Buddhism, which had originated in India several centuries earlier, found new audiences among the cosmopolitan merchant communities of Central Asia. Buddhist monasteries established along the trade routes provided not only spiritual guidance, but also practical services for travelers, including rest facilities, medical care, and protection from bandits. The spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road would prove to be one of the most significant cultural developments in human history. Buddhist monks and merchants carried their beliefs eastward into China, where they encountered and influenced existing Confucian and Taoist traditions. At the same time, Buddhist communities in Central Asia developed their own distinctive interpretations of Buddhist doctrine that incorporated elements from local religious and philosophical traditions. Christian communities also began to establish themselves along the trade routes, particularly in areas under Roman or Parthian control. These early Christian groups often included merchants and craftsmen who had converted to the new religion and carried their beliefs with them as they traveled for commercial purposes. The cosmopolitan environment of the trade route cities provided fertile ground for religious innovation and cross-cultural dialogue. The technological exchange facilitated by the Silk Road network had equally profound implications for economic and military development throughout Eurasia. Chinese innovations in metallurgy, papermaking, and mechanical engineering spread westward, while techniques developed in the Mediterranean world and Central Asia moved eastward into China. This technological diffusion accelerated the pace of innovation throughout the connected regions and contributed to the economic prosperity that sustained the trade network. Agricultural exchange proved particularly important for the long-term sustainability of transcontinental trade. New crops introduced from distant regions could dramatically increase agricultural productivity and support larger populations, which in turn generated greater demand for trade goods. Chinese agricultural techniques helped improve farming in Central Asian oases, while crops from the Mediterranean and Central Asia expanded the diversity and productivity of Chinese agriculture. The military implications of increased cultural and technological exchange were equally significant. Improvements in weapons, armor, and military tactics spread rapidly along the trade routes, forcing all major powers to continuously upgrade their military capabilities to maintain their strategic positions. The famous Chinese crossbow technology reached Roman territories, while Roman siege techniques influenced military development in Central Asian kingdoms. But perhaps most importantly, the Silk Road network was creating new forms of political and diplomatic relationships that transcended traditional boundaries between civilizations. The complex web of commercial partnerships, cultural exchanges, and technological transfers was fostering a sense of interdependence that made purely military solutions to international disputes increasingly costly and impractical. By the end of the 1st century CE, the various routes that comprised the Silk Road network had become essential to the economic and political stability of every major power in Eurasia. The wealth generated by transcontinental trade was funding military expeditions, monumental construction projects, and cultural achievements that defined the golden ages of multiple civilizations. But this prosperity also created new vulnerabilities and dependencies that would shape the political development of the ancient world for centuries to come. The success of the early Silk Road network had attracted the attention of new players who recognized the strategic and economic potential of controlling key segments of the trade routes, Nomadic confederations, minor kingdoms, and emerging powers all sought to position themselves advantageously within the growing commercial system, creating new sources of conflict and cooperation that would drive the next phase of the Silk Road's development. The emergence of new powers seeking to control segments of the Silk Road created a complex web of alliances and conflicts that would define the second century of transcontinental trade. Among the most significant of these new players were the Kushan Empire, which rose to dominate the crucial territories of modern-day Afghanistan and northern India, and the various city-states of the Tarim Basin, which controlled the desert routes through Central Asia. The Kushan Empire represented perhaps the most successful example of a civilization built specifically around transcontinental trade. Under rulers like Kanishka the Great, the Kushans transformed themselves from a relatively minor nomadic confederation into a sophisticated empire that controlled some of the most strategic territories along the Silk Road network. The Kushan capital at Peshawar became a cosmopolitan center where merchants from across Eurasia gathered to exchange goods and ideas. What made the Kushan Empire particularly remarkable was its conscious embrace of cultural diversity as a source of strength rather than a threat to unity. Kushan rulers patronized Buddhist monasteries while also supporting Greek temples, Persian fire altars, and Hindu shrines. This religious tolerance created an environment where merchants from vastly different cultural backgrounds could conduct business without fear of persecution or discrimination. The Kushan approach to managing trade routes differed from both the Chinese model of state control and the Parthian system of private enterprise. Instead, the Kushans developed a hybrid system that combined government oversight with commercial flexibility. Kushan officials established and maintained the infrastructure necessary for safe travel, including roads, bridges, rest stations, and security patrols, while allowing private merchants considerable freedom in organizing their commercial activities. This balanced approach proved extraordinarily profitable for the Kushan treasury. The empire collected taxes on all goods passing through its territories, generated revenue from the services provided to merchants, and participated directly in trade through state-sponsored expeditions. The wealth generated by these activities funded impressive architectural projects, supported flourishing artistic traditions, and maintained the military forces necessary to protect the trade routes from bandits and hostile neighbors. The Kushan Empire's commitment to facilitating transcontinental trade also drove significant innovations in transportation and logistics. Kushan engineers improved existing roads and constructed new ones that could handle the heavy traffic generated by large merchant caravans. They developed standardized systems for measuring distances, marking routes, and providing emergency assistance to travelers who encountered difficulties. Perhaps most importantly, the Kushans pioneered new approaches to international commerce that would influence trading practices throughout the Silk Road network. They established diplomatic relationships with all major trading partners, creating formal agreements that protected merchant rights and established procedures for resolving commercial disputes. These agreements served as models for similar arrangements between other kingdoms and helped create the legal framework that made large-scale transcontinental trade possible. The city-states of the Tarim Basin played an equally crucial role in the development of the Silk Road network, though their approach differed significantly from the Kushan model. Cities like Kashgar, Khotan, and Turpan were essentially commercial republics that existed primarily to facilitate trade between the major empires. These urban centers developed unique forms of government that prioritized commercial interests above traditional concerns about military conquest or territorial expansion. The Tarim Basin cities faced unique challenges that required innovative solutions. Located in some of the world's most inhospitable desert regions, these communities had to develop sophisticated water management systems that could sustain both permanent populations and the temporary influx of thousands of merchants and their animals. They created elaborate networks of underground channels, known as karez, that brought water from distant mountain sources to irrigate their oasis settlements. The harsh environment of the Tarim Basin also forced these cities to develop remarkable expertise in desert survival and navigation. Local guides became renowned throughout the Silk Road network for their ability to lead caravans safely across treacherous desert routes, where a single navigational error could result in death from thirst or exposure. This specialized knowledge made the Tarim Basin cities indispensable partners for any merchant seeking to cross Central Asia. The commercial success of these desert cities attracted artisans and craftsmen from across Eurasia, creating unique hybrid cultures that combined elements from Chinese, Persian, Indian, and Greco-Roman traditions. The art and architecture of cities like Khotan reflected this cosmopolitan character, featuring Buddhist sculptures carved by Greek-trained artists, Persian-style textiles woven from Chinese silk, and architectural elements that combined Roman engineering techniques with local building materials. The religious life of the Tarim Basin cities was equally diverse and innovative. Buddhist monasteries served not only as spiritual centers, but also as banks, hospitals, and educational institutions that provided essential services to the trading community. These monasteries often maintained libraries containing texts in multiple languages and scripts, making them centers of learning that attracted scholars from throughout the known world. The prosperity generated by transcontinental trade during the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE created what historians now recognize as the first truly global economy in human history. Goods produced in one corner of Eurasia could be found in markets thousands of miles away, while technologies and ideas spread with unprecedented speed across vast geographical distances. The scale and sophistication of this commercial network exceeded anything that would be seen again until the European age of exploration. Chinese silk reached not only Roman markets, but also communities in northern Europe, where it was prized by Germanic chieftains who traded amber and furs to obtain these exotic textiles. Roman glassware found its way into Chinese imperial collections, while Persian carpets graced the floors of palaces from Luoyang to Byzantium. The variety and volume of goods in circulation created new forms of wealth and new standards of luxury that influenced social development throughout the connected world. The cultural impact of this expanded trade network was equally profound. Artistic styles that developed in one region quickly influenced creative traditions thousands of miles away. The Gandhara school of Buddhist sculpture, which emerged in the Kushan territories, combined Greek artistic techniques with Indian religious iconography to create a distinctive style that spread throughout Central Asia and into China. Similarly, Chinese artistic innovations like landscape painting and decorative motifs appeared in Persian, Roman, and Central Asian art. Musical traditions also traveled along the trade routes, as merchants and travelers carried instruments, songs, and performance techniques from their homelands to distant markets. The Chinese pipa, Persian barbat, and various Central Asian stringed instruments influenced musical development throughout Eurasia, creating new hybrid forms that enrich the cultural life of trading communities. The intellectual exchange facilitated by the Silk Road was perhaps even more significant than the artistic cross-pollination. Mathematical concepts developed in India reached China and the Mediterranean world, while Chinese innovations in astronomy and engineering spread westward. The translation of texts between different languages and scripts became a major scholarly activity in cosmopolitan trading centers, creating the first systematic programs of international academic exchange. Medical knowledge proved particularly valuable as it traveled along the trade routes. Chinese medical techniques, including acupuncture and herbal remedies, found new applications in Central Asian and Persian healing traditions. Similarly, medical knowledge from India and the Mediterranean world enhanced Chinese understanding of anatomy, surgery, and pharmaceutical preparation. This medical exchange had immediate practical benefits for the trading communities, where access to diverse healing traditions could mean the difference between life and death for merchants far from home. The linguistic impact of increased cultural contact was equally remarkable. Many trading centers developed their own pidgin languages that combined elements from multiple linguistic traditions, allowing merchants who spoke different native languages to communicate effectively. These commercial languages often incorporated specialized vocabulary for describing goods, negotiating prices, and arranging transportation that reflected the practical needs of international trade. The administrative challenges created by managing such a complex international network drove innovations in record-keeping, accounting, and commercial law that would influence business practices for centuries to come. Merchant communities developed standardized contracts, credit instruments, and insurance arrangements that made it possible to conduct large-scale commercial transactions across vast distances despite the risks involved. Banking systems evolved to handle the complex financial requirements of transcontinental trade. Rather than carrying large quantities of precious metals across dangerous routes, merchants could deposit funds in one city and withdraw equivalent amounts in distant locations through networks of affiliated banking houses. These financial innovations reduce the risks associated with long-distance trade while making it possible to conduct much larger commercial transactions. The success of the Silk Road network during its golden age created new forms of international cooperation that transcended traditional political and cultural boundaries. Diplomatic missions regularly traveled between distant courts to negotiate trade agreements, resolve disputes, and coordinate responses to common threats like banditry or natural disasters. These diplomatic relationships created the first systematic international relations in human history. Military cooperation also became increasingly important as the value of the trade routes attracted the attention of various groups seeking to profit through conquest or extortion. The major powers learned to coordinate their security efforts, sharing intelligence about threats, and sometimes conducting joint military operations to eliminate particularly dangerous bandit groups or hostile nomadic confederations. Environmental challenges required similar cooperation, as droughts, floods, or other natural disasters in one region could disrupt trade flows throughout the entire network. The various kingdoms and city-states developed systems for sharing information about conditions along different routes and coordinating relief efforts when natural disasters threatened the trading communities. The technological innovations driven by the practical requirements of managing transcontinental trade had impacts that extended far beyond commercial activities. Improvements in transportation, communication, and logistics found applications in military, agricultural, and urban development projects that enhanced the overall prosperity and capability of the participating civilizations. Navigation techniques developed for crossing the Central Asian deserts proved valuable for maritime exploration and military campaigns. Engineering innovations created for building roads and bridges in difficult terrain enhanced the ability of various kingdoms to develop their domestic infrastructure. Communication systems designed to coordinate commercial activities across vast distances improved the administrative efficiency of imperial governments. The accumulated prosperity generated by several centuries of successful transcontinental trade created the economic foundation for some of the greatest cultural achievements in human history. The Tang dynasty in China, the Abbasid Caliphate in the Islamic world, and the Byzantine Empire all built their golden ages on wealth that derived largely from their participation in Silk Road commerce. But this prosperity also created new vulnerabilities and dependencies that would eventually contribute to the network's decline. The concentration of wealth in trading centers made them attractive targets for conquest by military powers that lacked the diplomatic sophistication to maintain the complex relationships necessary for successful commercial operations. The interdependence created by specialized production and long-distance trade meant that disruptions in one region could have cascading effects throughout the entire network. The rise of new powers seeking to control or redirect trade flows would create the political pressures that would eventually transform the character of the Silk Road network. The expansion of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries, the emergence of new nomadic confederations in Central Asia, and the development of alternative maritime routes would all contribute to fundamental changes in how transcontinental trade was organized and controlled. The 7th century brought winds of change that would reshape the ancient world in ways no merchant or diplomat could have foreseen. From the Arabian Peninsula emerged a force that would fundamentally alter the religious, cultural, and commercial landscape of Eurasia. The rapid expansion of Islamic civilization under the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates didn't merely conquer territories. It transformed the very nature of how transcontinental trade operated, creating new opportunities while simultaneously disrupting established patterns that had endured for centuries. The Islamic conquest of Persia in 651 CE marked a pivotal moment for the Silk Road network. The Sassanid Empire, which had controlled crucial segments of the trade routes for over 4 centuries, collapsed almost overnight as Arab armies swept across Iranian territories with unprecedented speed and efficiency. This conquest placed Islamic rulers in control of some of the most profitable sections of the transcontinental trade network, including the vital routes that connected Central Asia with the Mediterranean world. Unlike previous conquerors who had often disrupted trade in their pursuit of military objectives, the early Islamic caliphs recognized the immense value of the commercial networks they had inherited. The Prophet Muhammad himself had been a merchant before his religious calling, and Islamic law contained detailed provisions for regulating commerce and protecting merchant rights. This commercial orientation meant that Islamic expansion often enhanced rather than hindered transcontinental trade. The Islamic approach to managing conquered territories reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to extract maximum benefit from commercial activities while maintaining the stability necessary for long-term prosperity. Rather than imposing uniform administrative systems across their vast domains, Islamic rulers often preserved existing commercial arrangements while adding new layers of taxation and regulation that channeled additional revenues to the central treasury. Damascus, the Umayyad capital, quickly emerged as one of the most important commercial centers in the Islamic world. The city's strategic location between the Mediterranean and the inland routes to Central Asia made it a natural hub for coordinating trade flows between East and West. Syrian merchants, building on centuries of commercial experience, developed new trading networks that extended Islamic commercial influence deep into Central Asia and beyond. The Islamic conquest of Central Asian territories proceeded more gradually than the lightning campaigns that had subdued Persia and Syria. The cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv didn't fall to Arab armies until the early 8th century, and even then, the conquest often involved complex negotiations rather than simple military occupation. Local rulers frequently agreed to pay tribute and accept nominal Islamic authority in exchange for maintaining control over their territories and commercial operations. This gradual integration of Central Asian territories into the Islamic world created unique hybrid cultures that combined Islamic religious and legal traditions with local commercial practices and cultural customs. Samarkand, in particular, became a remarkable example of this cultural synthesis. The city's merchants embraced Islam while maintaining their traditional expertise in organizing long-distance trade expeditions. Islamic scholars established madrasas and libraries alongside existing educational institutions, creating centers of learning that attracted students from across the known world. The Islamic emphasis on literacy and learning had profound implications for commercial development along the Silk Road. Islamic law required detailed record-keeping for commercial transactions, while Islamic educational traditions emphasized mathematical and astronomical knowledge that proved invaluable for navigation and accounting. The widespread adoption of Arabic as a scholarly and commercial language created a common medium of communication that facilitated trade across vast linguistic and cultural boundaries. Islamic banking and financial innovations revolutionized the way transcontinental trade was financed and organized. The prohibition on charging interest led to the development of sophisticated profit-sharing arrangements and investment partnerships that distributed risks and rewards more equitably among merchants and financiers. These financial instruments made it possible to organize much larger trading expeditions while reducing the catastrophic losses that could result from the failure of a single venture. The Islamic legal system also provided new frameworks for resolving commercial disputes and enforcing contracts across cultural boundaries. Islamic courts in major trading centers developed specialized expertise in international commercial law, creating legal precedents that were recognized throughout the Islamic world. This legal uniformity reduced the transaction costs associated with long-distance trade and made it easier for merchants to operate in unfamiliar territories. Meanwhile, the Tang dynasty in China was experiencing its own golden age, largely fueled by the prosperity generated by Silk Road commerce. Under emperors like Taizong and Xuanzong, China achieved unprecedented levels of cultural sophistication and international influence. The Tang capital at Chang'an became the largest city in the world, with a population approaching 2 million people drawn from across Eurasia by the opportunities created by transcontinental trade. The cosmopolitan character of Tang China reflected the empire's deep integration into the Silk Road network. Foreign merchants established permanent communities in Chinese cities, bringing with them religious traditions, artistic styles, and commercial practices that enriched Chinese culture. Buddhist monasteries flourished under imperial patronage, while Zoroastrian, Manichaean, and even Christian communities found acceptance in the tolerant atmosphere of Tang society. Chinese technological innovations during the Tang period had far-reaching implications for global development. The perfection of woodblock printing made it possible to produce books and documents on an unprecedented scale, facilitating the spread of knowledge throughout the connected world. Improvements in metallurgy and engineering enhanced the quality of Chinese manufactured goods, while agricultural innovations increased food production and supported larger urban populations. The Tang government's approach to managing international trade reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to balance state interests with commercial flexibility. While maintaining overall control over foreign trade through licensing systems and designated ports of entry, Chinese officials allowed considerable autonomy to merchant communities and often provided state backing for particularly ambitious commercial ventures. The famous journey of the Buddhist monk Xuanzang to India between 629 and 645 CE illustrated both the possibilities and challenges of transcontinental travel during this period. Xuanzang's quest to obtain authentic Buddhist texts required him to cross some of the most dangerous territories along the Silk Road, including regions controlled by hostile nomadic groups and areas where political instability made travel extremely hazardous. Xuanzang's detailed accounts of his travels provide invaluable insights into the condition of the Silk Road network during the 7th century. His descriptions of the cities, peoples, and conditions he encountered reveal a world of remarkable diversity and sophistication, where major urban centers supported populations of hundreds of thousands, while maintaining extensive commercial and cultural connections with distant regions. The monk's journey also highlighted the crucial role that religious communities played in supporting transcontinental travel. Buddhist monasteries provided not only spiritual guidance, but also practical assistance, including food, shelter, medical care, and protection from bandits. These religious institutions often maintained their own commercial operations, using trade revenues to fund their charitable activities and educational programs. The interaction between Islamic and Chinese civilizations along the Silk Road created new forms of cultural and technological exchange that would influence development throughout Eurasia. Chinese papermaking techniques reached the Islamic world in the 8th century, revolutionizing scholarship and administration throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Islamic astronomical and mathematical knowledge, much of it derived from Indian and Greek sources, enhanced Chinese understanding of navigation and engineering. The textile trade, which remained the backbone of Silk Road commerce, underwent significant changes during this period. While Chinese silk continued to be prized throughout the known world, Islamic territories began producing their own high-quality textiles that competed with Chinese products in some markets. The development of cotton cultivation in Central Asia provided an alternative to silk that was both more affordable and better suited to the climatic conditions of many regions. The spice trade also expanded dramatically as Islamic merchants established direct connections with the production centers of Southeast Asia and India. Routes that had previously required multiple intermediaries were consolidated under Islamic commercial networks, reducing costs and increasing the variety of exotic products available in distant markets. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg became increasingly common in the cuisine and medicine of civilizations, thousands of miles from their points of origin. The 8th century marked the peak of classical Silk Road prosperity, with trade volumes and cultural exchange reaching levels that would not be equaled again for many centuries. The Abbasid Revolution of 750 CE, which overthrew the Umayyad Caliphate and moved the Islamic capital from Damascus to Baghdad, created new opportunities for commercial development while maintaining the basic framework that had made Islamic participation in transcontinental trade so successful. Baghdad's location on the Tigris River, close to the ancient commercial centers of Mesopotamia, made it ideally positioned to serve as a hub for trade between the Islamic heartland and the Eastern territories. The city quickly grew to become one of the largest and most prosperous urban centers in the world, attracting merchants, scholars, and artisans from across the known world. The famous House of Wisdom established by the Abbasid caliphs became a center for translating and preserving knowledge from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese sources. The Abbasid period also saw the development of increasingly sophisticated banking and credit systems that made transcontinental trade more efficient and less risky. Merchant families established branches in multiple cities, creating networks that could coordinate commercial activities across vast distances. These merchant banking houses developed their own systems of credit instruments and currency exchange that operated independently of government monetary systems. However, the very success of the Silk Road network was beginning to create the conditions for its eventual transformation. The enormous wealth concentrated in trading centers attracted the attention of various groups seeking to profit through conquest rather than commerce. The rise of new nomadic confederations in Central Asia, combined with increasing political instability in some of the key trading regions, began to disrupt the delicate balance of cooperation that had sustained transcontinental trade for centuries. The An Lushan rebellion that devastated Tang China between 755 and 763 CE demonstrated how quickly political instability could disrupt even the most prosperous commercial networks. The rebellion, led by a general of Central Asian origin, resulted in massive destruction throughout northern China and temporarily severed many of the connections that had linked Chinese markets with the Silk Road network. Although the Tang dynasty eventually suppressed the rebellion and restored order, the empire never fully recovered its former prosperity and international influence. The costs of the civil war forced the Chinese government to impose higher taxes on trade and reduce the subsidies that had supported many commercial activities. These economic pressures made Chinese participation in transcontinental trade less profitable and began to shift commercial flows toward alternative routes. The rise of the Tibetan Empire during the 8th century created additional challenges for Silk Road commerce. Tibetan forces gained control of several crucial mountain passes and began demanding tribute from merchant caravans seeking to cross their territories. While Tibetan rulers eventually established their own participation in transcontinental trade, their initial military activities disrupted established routes and forced merchants to develop alternative pathways. Similar pressures were emerging in other parts of the Silk Road network as various groups sought to capitalize on the wealth generated by transcontinental commerce. The fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate into semi-independent provinces reduced the political stability that had supported Islamic commercial expansion, while new nomadic movements in Central Asia threatened the security of the traditional overland routes. The development of maritime alternatives to the overland Silk Road routes began to accelerate during this period, as merchants sought ways to avoid the increasing costs and risks associated with land-based travel. Islamic merchants, building on existing Indian Ocean trading networks, established sea routes that could transport goods between the Middle East and China more quickly and safely than the traditional overland paths. The maritime routes offered several advantages over land-based alternatives. Ships could carry much larger quantities of goods than camel caravans, reducing the per-unit transportation costs for bulk commodities. Sea travel also avoided many of the political complications associated with crossing multiple kingdoms and dealing with various taxation systems. Perhaps most importantly, maritime routes were less vulnerable to disruption by nomadic raids or political instability in specific regions. The growth of maritime trade didn't immediately replace the overland Silk Road, but it did begin to compete for the most valuable cargoes and reduce the profits available to land-based merchants. This competition forced overland traders to specialize in goods that were either too valuable to risk on sea voyages or too bulky to transport efficiently by ship. The traditional Silk Road network began to focus increasingly on luxury goods and specialized products, while bulk commodities shifted to maritime routes. The 9th century witnessed the beginning of fundamental changes in the global trading system that would eventually transform the character of transcontinental commerce. While the classical Silk Road continued to operate and remained profitable for many participants, the network was no longer the dominant force in international trade that it had been during its golden age. New powers, new routes, and new technologies were creating alternative systems that would eventually challenge the supremacy of the ancient overland pathways. The emergence of the Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa and the expansion of Islamic influence into sub-Saharan Africa created new commercial opportunities that drew resources and attention away from the traditional Central Asian routes. The discovery of new sources of gold and ivory in Africa provided Islamic merchants with valuable commodities that could compete effectively with traditional Silk Road products in international markets. Technological innovations in shipbuilding and navigation were making maritime trade increasingly attractive compared to overland alternatives. The development of the lateen sail and improvements in hull design allowed ships to travel more efficiently and carry larger cargoes, while advances in astronomical navigation reduced the risks associated with long-distance sea voyages. The political fragmentation that characterized much of the Islamic world during the 9th and 10th centuries created additional challenges for overland trade, while providing new opportunities for maritime commerce. As the Abbasid Caliphate lost effective control over its eastern provinces, local rulers began imposing their own taxes and regulations on merchant caravans. This political fragmentation increased the transaction costs associated with overland trade and made sea routes relatively more attractive. The rise of new powers in Central Asia, including various Turkic confederations and the emerging Ghaznavid state, created additional complications for traditional Silk Road operations. While these new rulers often sought to profit from transcontinental trade, their military activities and territorial disputes frequently disrupted commercial flows and forced merchants to seek alternative routes or partners. Despite these mounting challenges, the Silk Road network remained remarkably resilient and continued to adapt to changing circumstances. Merchant communities developed new strategies for managing political risks, including the establishment of commercial partnerships that could operate under different political systems and the creation of insurance arrangements that protected against losses due to political instability. The cultural and intellectual exchange that had been fostered by centuries of transcontinental trade continued to flourish, even as the commercial foundations of the network faced increasing pressures. The translation movement that had preserved and transmitted knowledge from classical antiquity reached new heights during the 9th and 10th centuries, creating intellectual legacies that would influence human development for centuries to come. The story of the Silk Road during this period of transition reveals both the remarkable achievements of ancient commercial civilization and the complex factors that ultimately led to its transformation. The network that had connected civilizations and created the first truly global economy was beginning to evolve into new forms that would shape the medieval and early modern world in ways that its original creators could never have imagined. The 10th century dawned with the Silk Road network, standing at a crossroads between its glorious past and an uncertain future. While the great overland route still pulsed with commercial activity, new forces were reshaping the very foundations of transcontinental trade. The emergence of the Song dynasty in China brought fresh energy to Eastern markets, but it also marked the beginning of a more inward-looking Chinese approach that would gradually reduce the empire's dependence on foreign commerce. The Song rulers, faced with constant pressure from the northern nomadic peoples, including the Khitan Liao dynasty, adopted defensive strategies that prioritized internal development over external expansion. This shift in Chinese policy had profound implications for Silk Road commerce. While Chinese goods remained highly sought after in distant markets, the imperial government began to view foreign trade more as a diplomatic tool than as a source of essential revenue or strategic materials. Chinese technological innovations during the Song period would ultimately prove more significant for global development than any immediate commercial policies. The perfection of gunpowder, the magnetic compass, and movable type printing created technologies that would eventually revolutionize warfare, navigation, and communication throughout the world. However, the Chinese tendency to treat these innovations as state secrets initially limited their spread along the traditional trade routes. The compass technology proved particularly transformative for maritime navigation, making sea voyages far more reliable and predictable than they had been in earlier periods. Islamic and Indian merchants quickly adopted these navigational improvements, using them to develop increasingly sophisticated maritime trading networks that could compete effectively with overland alternatives. The precision offered by magnetic navigation allowed ships to maintain course during extended ocean voyages, opening up new possibilities for direct trade between distant regions. Meanwhile, Central Asia was experiencing its own period of transformation as various Turkic peoples established new kingdoms and confederations throughout the region. The Karakhanid Khanate, which controlled much of modern-day Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, emerged as a significant power that sought to balance its nomadic heritage with the requirements of governing settled populations and managing commercial activities. The Karakhanids' conversion to Islam during the 10th century created new dynamics within the Central Asian political landscape. As the first major Turkic confederation to adopt Islam as a state religion, the Karakhanids served as a bridge between the Islamic world and the traditional nomadic cultures of the steppes. This religious transformation facilitated closer commercial relationships with Islamic merchants while maintaining the military capabilities that made nomadic confederations formidable political forces. The Islamic conversion of Turkic peoples across Central Asia represented more than just religious change. It marked the beginning of a new phase in the cultural development of the region. Islamic educational institutions established in Turkic territories created new centers of learning that combined traditional Islamic scholarship with local knowledge about geography, astronomy, and practical sciences. These hybrid educational systems produced scholars and administrators who could operate effectively in both nomadic and settled environments. The city of Kashgar emerged during this period as perhaps the most important commercial center in Central Asia, serving as a crucial link between Chinese, Islamic, and Indian trading networks. The city's strategic location at the intersection of multiple trade routes made it a natural hub for coordinating commercial activities across vast distances. Kashgar's markets featured goods from virtually every corner of the known world, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that attracted merchants, scholars, and adventurers from across Eurasia. The development of Kashgar as a major trading center required sophisticated solutions to the logistical challenges of managing transcontinental commerce. The city's rulers invested heavily in infrastructure, including warehouses, caravanserais, and water management systems that could support the temporary influx of thousands of merchants and their animals. They also established legal and administrative systems that could handle disputes between traders from different cultural backgrounds and ensure fair treatment for all participants in the commercial network. The prosperity generated by Kashgar's commercial activities supported remarkable cultural achievements that reflected the city's position at the crossroads of civilizations. Local artisans developed distinctive styles that combined Chinese, Islamic, Persian, and Central Asian artistic traditions, creating unique hybrid forms that influenced artistic development throughout the region. The city's libraries and schools attracted scholars from across the known world, making Kashgar a center of learning that rivaled the great cities of China and the Islamic heartland. The Ghaznavid Empire, which emerged in eastern Afghanistan during the late 10th century, represented another new force that sought to profit from and control segments of the Silk Road network. Under rulers like Mahmud of Ghazni, this Islamic state launched repeated campaigns into India that generated enormous wealth through conquest and tribute. The resources obtained from these military expeditions were invested in developing commercial infrastructure and establishing trading relationships that extended Ghaznavid influence throughout Central Asia. Mahmud of Ghazni's court attracted merchants, scholars, and artists from across the Islamic world, creating a cultural center that rivaled Baghdad and Cairo in its sophistication and international connections. The wealth flowing through Ghaznavid territories from both Indian conquests and transcontinental trade supported patronage systems that funded major architectural projects, scholarly activities, and artistic innovations. The city of Ghazni became renowned for its libraries, workshops, and educational institutions that preserved and transmitted knowledge from multiple cultural traditions. The Ghaznavid approach to managing trade reflected the empire's dual character as both a military state built on conquest and a commercial power dependent on peaceful exchange. Ghaznavid rulers provided security for merchant caravans while extracting substantial revenues through taxation and tribute. They also participated directly in trade through state-sponsored expeditions and partnerships with private merchants, creating hybrid public-private arrangements that maximize both security and profitability. The Indian subcontinent during this period was experiencing its own commercial renaissance, as various regional kingdoms competed to attract and profit from international trade. The Chola dynasty in southern India had emerged as a major maritime power, establishing trading relationships and even launching naval expeditions that extended Indian influence throughout Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean region. The Chola expansion into Southeast Asia created new opportunities for transcontinental trade by establishing secure bases and commercial partnerships in regions that produced valuable spices, precious stones, and exotic woods. These maritime networks complemented and sometimes competed with the traditional overland routes, providing alternative pathways for goods moving between Asia and the Middle East. The development of Indian Ocean trading networks also facilitated the spread of Indian cultural and religious influences throughout Southeast Asia. Hindu and Buddhist traditions established themselves in Java, Sumatra, and other Indonesian islands, creating cultural connections that supported commercial relationships. These religious and cultural ties made it easier for Indian merchants to operate in Southeast Asian markets, while providing local rulers with access to Indian expertise in administration, architecture, and agricultural techniques. The spice trade, which had been a secondary component of Silk Road commerce during earlier periods, began to assume greater importance as maritime routes made it possible to transport these valuable but bulky commodities more efficiently than overland caravans could manage. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, and various spices from the Indonesian archipelago commanded premium prices in Middle Eastern and European markets. generating profits that attracted increasing numbers of merchants to the Indian Ocean trade. The growing importance of maritime spice routes created new forms of competition for the traditional Silk Road network. While overland routes remained essential for transporting silk, precious stones, and other high-value, low-weight commodities, they began to lose market share in the trade of bulkier goods that could be transported more economically by ship. This competition forced overland merchants to specialize increasingly in luxury goods and to develop new strategies for maintaining their competitive advantages. The Byzantine Empire, which controlled the western terminus of many Silk Road routes, was adapting to these changing commercial patterns while dealing with its own internal challenges and external pressures. The empire's strategic position between Europe and Asia continued to generate substantial revenues from transcontinental trade. But Byzantine merchants and officials recognized the need to develop new approaches to maintain their competitive position in an increasingly complex international marketplace. Byzantine commercial law evolved to accommodate the changing requirements of international trade, incorporating new financial instruments and dispute resolution mechanisms that reflected the empire's experience in managing relationships between merchants from vastly different cultural backgrounds. These legal innovations influenced commercial practices throughout the Mediterranean region and provided models that were adopted by other trading powers seeking to attract international business. The cultural exchange facilitated by continued Silk Road commerce during this transitional period produced remarkable innovations in art, architecture, and technology that reflected the synthesis of traditions from across Eurasia. Islamic geometric patterns began incorporating Chinese motifs, while Byzantine religious art showed influences from Central Asian and Persian artistic traditions. These cultural fusions created new aesthetic vocabularies that enriched the artistic heritage of all participating civilizations. Scientific and technological exchange continued to accelerate despite the growing political fragmentation that characterized many regions along the trade routes. Astronomical knowledge developed in Islamic centers reached China and India, while Chinese innovations in engineering and manufacturing spread westward through commercial and diplomatic contacts. This intellectual cross-pollination contributed to advances in mathematics, medicine, and natural philosophy that benefited scholars throughout the connected world. The translation of texts between different languages remained a crucial activity in major trading centers, where scholars with multilingual capabilities were essential for facilitating both commercial transactions and intellectual exchange. Libraries in cities like Samarkand, Baghdad, and Constantinople maintained collections of works in multiple languages and scripts, creating repositories of human knowledge that transcended individual cultural traditions. Medical knowledge proved particularly valuable as it traveled along the trade routes, with practitioners in different regions sharing techniques and remedies that enhanced healing capabilities throughout the network. The cosmopolitan environment of trading centers created ideal conditions for medical innovation, as physicians could observe and treat patients from various cultural backgrounds while learning from colleagues trained in different medical traditions. The 11th century brought new challenges and opportunities that would further reshape the character of transcontinental trade. The emergence of the Seljuk Turks as a major power in the Middle East and Central Asia created new political dynamics that affected commercial relationships throughout the region. The Seljuk conquest of much of Anatolia and their conflicts with the Byzantine Empire disrupted some traditional routes while opening new possibilities for trade through Turkish-controlled territories. The Seljuk approach to managing commerce reflected their nomadic origins combined with their adoption of Islamic administrative practices. Seljuk rulers understood the importance of trade revenues for maintaining their empire, but they also retained the nomadic emphasis on mobility and flexibility that sometimes conflicted with the stability required for long-term commercial relationships. The First Crusade, launched at the end of the 11th century, represented another major disruption to traditional trade patterns. While the Crusades are often viewed primarily as religious conflicts, they had profound commercial implications that affected trading relationships throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The establishment of Crusader states in the Levant created new political entities that sought to control and profit from transcontinental trade, adding another layer of complexity to an already intricate commercial network. The Crusader states' position along crucial segments of the trade routes between Asia and Europe gave them significant leverage in international commerce, but their military character and religious orientation sometimes created tensions with Muslim merchants and rulers who had previously participated peacefully in transcontinental trade. These political complications forced merchants to develop new strategies and alternative routes that could bypass areas of conflict. The Italian maritime republics, particularly Venice and Genoa, began to emerge as major players in Mediterranean trade during this period. Taking advantage of the commercial opportunities created by the Crusades, while developing their own independent relationships with Islamic and Byzantine trading partners. These Italian city-states possessed advanced shipbuilding technologies and financial systems that made them formidable competitors in maritime commerce. The Venetian approach to international trade combined commercial sophistication with diplomatic flexibility, allowing the Republic to maintain profitable relationships with various powers regardless of their religious or political differences. This pragmatic approach to commerce would prove increasingly important as political conflicts made traditional trading relationships more difficult to maintain. The development of new financial instruments by Italian merchants revolutionized the way international trade was financed and conducted. The creation of bills of exchange, commercial partnerships, and sophisticated accounting systems reduced the risks and costs associated with long-distance commerce, while making it possible to conduct much larger transactions than had been practical under earlier systems. These financial innovations spread throughout the Mediterranean region and eventually influenced commercial practices along the traditional Silk Road routes. Merchants operating in Central Asian and Middle Eastern markets began adopting Italian-developed financial techniques, creating hybrid systems that combined traditional Islamic commercial law with new European innovations. The intellectual ferment created by increased cultural contact during the Crusader period also contributed to significant advances in geography, navigation, and commercial knowledge. The compilation of new maps and geographical treatises reflected the accumulated experience of merchants and travelers who had traversed routes throughout Eurasia, creating more accurate and detailed knowledge of world geography than had previously been available. The preservation and transmission of classical knowledge continued to be facilitated by transcontinental trade networks, even as political conflicts disrupted some traditional routes. Scholars in different regions maintained correspondence and exchanged texts through commercial channels, ensuring that intellectual developments in one part of the world could influence thinking in distant regions. The translation of Arabic texts into Latin during this period made Islamic scholarship accessible to European intellectuals, contributing to the intellectual renaissance that would characterize the later medieval period. Many of these translations were facilitated by commercial contacts between Islamic and Christian scholars who met in the cosmopolitan trading centers that continued to operate despite political tensions. The cultural synthesis that resulted from continued contact between different civilizations produced new forms of artistic expression that reflected the complex identities of communities that existed at the crossroads between different worlds. The art and architecture of trading centers often combined elements from multiple traditions, creating unique hybrid styles that couldn't be found in the heartlands of any single civilization. Musical traditions also continued to evolve through cross-cultural contact, as merchants and travelers carried instruments, songs, and performance techniques from their homelands to distant markets. The trading centers became laboratories for musical innovation, where musicians from different traditions could experiment with new combinations of styles and techniques. As the 11th century drew to a close, the Silk Road network had survived numerous challenges and continued to facilitate remarkable exchanges of goods, ideas, and cultural influences. However, the fundamental character of transcontinental trade was changing in ways that would eventually lead to the emergence of new commercial systems and the gradual decline of the traditional overland routes that had connected civilizations for over a millennium. The 12th century witnessed the emergence of perhaps the most transformative force in the history of the Silk Road, the rise of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. What began as conflicts between scattered nomadic tribes on the Mongolian steppes would ultimately create the largest contiguous land empire in human history, fundamentally reshaping every aspect of transcontinental trade and cultural exchange. The Mongol conquests didn't merely disrupt existing commercial networks. They revolutionized the very concept of international commerce and created unprecedented opportunities for merchants willing to adapt to this new world order. The early years of Mongol expansion struck terror into the hearts of settled populations throughout Central Asia and beyond. Cities that had prospered for centuries as crucial links in the Silk Road network found themselves facing armies unlike anything they had previously encountered. The Mongols' military tactics, perfected through generations of warfare on the open steppes, proved devastatingly effective against the fortified cities and established armies of sedentary civilizations. Urban centers that had served as bastions of culture and commerce were reduced to rubble in matters of days, their populations scattered or destroyed. Samarkand, that jewel of Central Asian commerce that had thrived at the intersection of multiple trade routes for over a millennium, fell to Mongol forces in 1220 after a siege that demonstrated both the destructive power of nomadic warfare and the vulnerability of even the most prosperous trading centers. The city's elaborate irrigation systems, which had sustained its oasis economy for centuries, were deliberately destroyed as part of the Mongol strategy of psychological warfare. The merchant communities that had made Samarkand a cosmopolitan center of learning and culture were dispersed across vast distances, carrying with them only fragments of the commercial knowledge and cultural traditions that had accumulated over generations. Bukhara, another cornerstone of the Central Asian trading network, suffered a similar fate when Mongol armies swept through the region. The city's famous libraries, which had preserved texts in multiple languages and scripts representing the accumulated wisdom of centuries of scholarly exchange, were burned or abandoned. The madrasas and commercial institutions that had made Bukhara a center of Islamic learning and international commerce were left in ruins, their scholars and merchants either killed or forced to flee to distant territories. Yet beneath this initial wave of destruction lay a paradoxical reality that would eventually transform the Mongol Empire from a force of devastation into the greatest facilitator of transcontinental trade in human history. The Mongols' nomadic origins had given them an intimate understanding of the geographic and logistical challenges involved in moving goods across vast distances. Their military organization, based on decimal units and sophisticated communication systems, provided a framework that could be adapted to manage commercial operations on an unprecedented scale. Genghis Khan himself, despite his reputation as a destroyer of cities, possessed a remarkably pragmatic understanding of the value of trade and skilled craftsmen. As Mongol conquests expanded beyond the initial targets of revenge and plunder, the Great Khan began implementing policies designed to harness rather than destroy the productive capabilities of conquered territories. Artisans and merchants who demonstrated useful skills found themselves relocated to areas where their expertise could serve Mongol interests, creating networks of skilled workers that spanned the empire. The Mongol approach to religious tolerance proved particularly beneficial for international commerce. Unlike many previous conquerors, who had imposed their own religious beliefs on subject populations, the Mongols maintained a policy of religious neutrality that allowed diverse communities to maintain their traditional practices and institutions. This tolerance created stable environments where merchants from different religious backgrounds could operate without fear of persecution, facilitating the kind of cross-cultural cooperation that had always been essential to successful transcontinental trade. The establishment of the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, across vast territories from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, created unprecedented security for long-distance travel. The Mongol military system, with its emphasis on mobility and communication, was perfectly suited to maintaining order along extended trade routes. Mongol patrols could respond rapidly to reports of banditry or other threats, while the empire's legal system provided consistent frameworks for resolving disputes between merchants from different cultural backgrounds. The famous YAM system, the Mongol Postal Relay Network, represented perhaps the most sophisticated communication system developed in the pre-modern world. Stations positioned at regular intervals along major routes provided fresh horses and supplies for official messengers, enabling information to travel across the empire at speeds that wouldn't be matched again until the development of modern transportation. This communication network served commercial as well as administrative purposes, allowing merchants to coordinate activities across vast distances and respond quickly to changing market conditions. Mongol administrative innovations also revolutionized the financial aspects of international trade. The empire's standardized currency system eliminated many of the exchange rate complications that had previously plagued transcontinental commerce, while Mongol backing provided security for credit instruments that could be honored throughout the empire's territories. These financial improvements reduced transaction costs and made it possible to conduct much larger commercial operations than had been practical under previous systems. The Mongol commitment to meritocracy created new opportunities for talented individuals, regardless of their ethnic or cultural backgrounds. Merchants and administrators who demonstrated competence found themselves appointed to positions of responsibility throughout the empire, creating cosmopolitan networks of officials who understood both local conditions and imperial policies. This administrative diversity proved particularly valuable for managing the complex relationships between different cultural groups that characterized major trading centers. Karakorum, the Mongol capital established by Ögedei Khan, became a remarkable example of the empire's cosmopolitan character and its commitment to facilitating international commerce. The city attracted merchants, craftsmen, and scholars from across the known world, creating a unique environment where Chinese engineers worked alongside Persian architects, where Islamic scholars debated with Christian theologians, and where merchants from Venice negotiated with traders from Central Asia. The famous accounts of visitors to Karakorum, including the Franciscan monk William of Rubruck and the Taoist monk Chuchuji, reveal the extraordinary diversity and sophistication of Mongol court culture. The Great Khan's palace featured architectural elements from multiple traditions, furnished with goods from across Eurasia, and staffed by advisors drawn from dozens of different ethnic and religious communities. This cultural synthesis reflected the Mongol Empire's role as a facilitator of global exchange, rather than simply a military conquering force. The Mongol approach to urban development reflected their understanding of cities as engines of commercial prosperity, rather than merely administrative centers or military strongholds. Conquered cities that demonstrated economic value were quickly rebuilt and expanded, often with improvements to infrastructure that enhanced their capacity to serve as trading hubs. The Mongols invested heavily in roads, bridges, and caravanserais that could support increased commercial traffic, viewing these improvements as investments that would generate long-term revenues for the imperial treasury. The integration of maritime and overland trade networks under Mongol rule created new possibilities for commercial coordination and efficiency. While the empire's heartland remained focused on overland routes across Central Asia, Mongol expansion into China provided access to sophisticated naval technologies and established maritime trading relationships. This combination of land and sea capabilities allowed Mongol administrators to coordinate commercial flows across multiple transportation modes in ways that maximized efficiency and profitability. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan in China, represented the culmination of Mongol efforts to harness, rather than destroy, the productive capabilities of conquered civilizations. Under Yuan rule, China experienced remarkable economic growth driven largely by expanded participation in international trade networks. Chinese technological innovations, including improvements in shipbuilding and navigation, were combined with Mongol organizational capabilities to create commercial systems that operated on scales previously unimaginable. Marco Polo's famous journey to the court of Kublai Khan illustrates both the opportunities and challenges that characterize transcontinental trade under Mongol rule. The young Venetian merchant's ability to travel safely from Europe to China and back again demonstrated the security and infrastructure that the Mongol Empire had created for international commerce. His detailed accounts of Chinese cities, technologies, and commercial practices provided European audiences with their first comprehensive glimpse of the sophisticated civilizations that existed in the Far East. The Polo family's commercial activities in China also revealed the extent to which European merchants could integrate themselves into Asian trading networks under Mongol protection. The Polos established business relationships with Chinese merchants, learned local languages and customs, and adapted their commercial strategies to take advantage of opportunities that existed in distant markets. Their success encouraged other European merchants to undertake similar journeys, gradually expanding the geographic scope of international commerce. The cultural exchange facilitated by increased commercial activity under Mongol rule produced remarkable innovations in art, science, and technology that reflected the synthesis of traditions from across Eurasia. Chinese printing technology spread westward along the trade routes, revolutionizing the production and distribution of books and documents throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Islamic astronomical knowledge reached China, enhancing Chinese understanding of navigation and calendar systems that were essential for coordinating commercial activities. Medical knowledge proved particularly valuable as it circulated through Mongol-controlled territories. Physicians trained in different medical traditions could observe and learn from each other in the cosmopolitan environments of major trading centers. Chinese acupuncture techniques were introduced to Central Asian and Middle Eastern medical practice, while Islamic surgical knowledge enhanced Chinese medical capabilities. This medical exchange had immediate practical benefits for the trading communities, where access to diverse healing traditions could be crucial for maintaining health during long journeys through challenging environments. The development of new artistic styles that combined elements from multiple cultural traditions reflected the creative possibilities opened up by increased cultural contact under Mongol rule. Persian miniature painting began incorporating Chinese landscape techniques, while Chinese ceramics showed influences from Islamic geometric patterns and Central Asian decorative motifs. These artistic innovations created new aesthetic vocabularies that enriched the cultural heritage of all participating civilizations. The Mongol period also witnessed significant advances in geographic knowledge as increased travel and communication provided more accurate information about distant territories. Maps produced during this era showed remarkable improvements in accuracy compared to earlier geographical works, reflecting the accumulated experience of merchants, diplomats, and administrators who had traversed routes throughout Eurasia. This geographic knowledge proved valuable for both commercial and military purposes, enabling more efficient route planning and better understanding of regional resources and capabilities. The technological innovations driven by the practical requirements of managing such a vast empire had implications that extended far beyond immediate commercial or administrative needs. Improvements in metallurgy developed for producing weapons and tools found applications in manufacturing and construction projects that enhanced overall economic productivity. Advances in communication systems created for military and administrative purposes could be adapted for commercial use, enabling merchants to coordinate activities across unprecedented distances. The standardization of weights, measures, and currencies across Mongol territories eliminated many of the transaction costs and complications that had previously hindered international trade. Merchants could now travel from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, using consistent systems of measurement and exchange, dramatically simplifying the logistical challenges of transcontinental commerce. This standardization represented one of the most significant contributions of Mongol rule to the development of global trading systems. The legal frameworks developed by Mongol administrators for governing diverse populations also provided important innovations in commercial law. The Mongol legal system incorporated elements from multiple legal traditions, while establishing consistent principles for resolving disputes and enforcing contracts across cultural boundaries. These legal innovations influenced commercial practices throughout the empire and provided models that would be adopted by subsequent trading systems. The environmental impact of increased commercial activity under Mongol rule created both opportunities and challenges for the empire's administrators. The concentration of large numbers of animals and people at trading centers required sophisticated waste management and water supply systems, driving innovations in urban planning and environmental engineering. At the same time, the expansion of agricultural production to support increased trade created pressures on natural resources that required careful management to maintain long-term sustainability. The social implications of expanded commercial activity were equally significant, as increased cultural contact created new forms of identity and community that transcended traditional ethnic and religious boundaries. Trading centers became melting pots where individuals from vastly different backgrounds could find common ground through shared commercial interests and mutual dependence. These cosmopolitan communities often developed their own hybrid cultures that combined elements from multiple traditions while serving the practical needs of international commerce. The educational institutions that emerged in major trading centers during the Mongol period reflected the empire's commitment to practical knowledge and cultural diversity. Schools and libraries established in cities like Beijing, Samarkand, and Tabriz brought together scholars from across the known world, creating centers of learning that combine Chinese, Islamic, Persian, and European intellectual traditions. These educational innovations contributed to advances in mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and other fields that benefited both commercial and scholarly activities. However, the very success of the Mongol Empire in facilitating transcontinental trade also created new vulnerabilities and dependencies that would eventually contribute to its fragmentation. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of Mongol elites created tensions with subject populations who bore the costs of supporting imperial expansion and administration. The complexity of managing such diverse territories and populations strained the empire's administrative capabilities and created opportunities for regional leaders to assert greater autonomy. The gradual conversion of Mongol rulers to various religions, particularly Islam and Buddhism, began to erode the religious neutrality that had been one of the empire's greatest strengths in managing diverse populations. As Mongol Khans adopted the religious and cultural practices of their subjects, the unified character of imperial administration began to fragment along religious and cultural lines. This fragmentation would eventually lead to conflicts between different parts of the empire and undermine the security and stability that had made transcontinental trade so profitable. The Black Death pandemic of the 14th century represented perhaps the greatest challenge faced by the transcontinental trading networks that had flourished under Mongol rule. The disease, which may have originated in Central Asian rodent populations, spread rapidly along the same trade routes that had carried goods and ideas across Eurasia for centuries. The pandemic's devastating impact on populations throughout the connected world demonstrated both the benefits and risks of the global interconnectedness that the Mongol Empire had created. The collapse of the Mongol Empire into competing khanates during the late 13th and early 14th centuries marked the beginning of a fundamental transformation that would reshape the entire structure of transcontinental trade. What had been a unified commercial system operating under consistent laws and protection became a fragmented network of competing powers, each seeking to maximize their own revenues from the lucrative trade flows that continued to pass through their territories. This fragmentation created new costs and complications for merchants, while simultaneously opening opportunities for alternative routes and trading partners. The Yuan dynasty in China, despite maintaining nominal allegiance to the Great Khan, increasingly focused on domestic concerns and regional Asian trade, rather than the transcontinental networks that had brought such prosperity during the height of Mongol unity. Chinese administrators, dealing with internal rebellions and the enormous costs of maintaining imperial infrastructure, imposed higher taxes on foreign merchants and reduced the subsidies that had previously supported international trading expeditions. These policy changes made Chinese participation in transcontinental commerce less attractive while encouraging the development of alternative trading relationships within East and Southeast Asia. The Ilkhanate in Persia faced similar pressures as conversion to Islam created new religious and cultural dynamics that affected relationships with both Eastern and Western trading partners. Persian administrators found themselves balancing the demands of Islamic religious authorities, who sometimes viewed certain forms of international commerce as theologically problematic, against the practical necessities of maintaining the tax revenues that sustained imperial administration. This religious transformation, while providing greater legitimacy with Persian populations, complicated relationships with Chinese and Central Asian trading partners who operated under different religious and cultural assumptions. The Golden Horde's control over the Western steppes and Eastern European territories created another center of commercial taxation that added costs to goods moving between Asia and European markets. Russian principalities, operating under Mongol oversight, developed their own trading relationships that sometimes competed with traditional Silk Road routes while providing alternative pathways for goods moving between Eastern and Western markets. The emergence of Moscow as a significant commercial center reflected these changing patterns of trade that increasingly bypassed the traditional Central Asian routes. The fragmentation of Mongol political unity coincided with the rise of new maritime powers that were developing alternative routes for transcontinental commerce. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt had established control over crucial segments of the Indian Ocean trade, creating new opportunities for goods to reach European markets through maritime routes that avoided many of the political complications and taxation systems that characterized overland travel. The Mamluks' strategic position between Asia and Europe provided them with significant leverage in international commerce, which they used to extract substantial revenues from transcontinental trade. Venice and Genoa, those Italian maritime republics that had emerged as significant players during the Crusader period, were expanding their trading networks to take advantage of new opportunities created by the fragmentation of Mongol power. Venetian merchants established permanent trading posts in Constantinople, Alexandria, and other strategic locations, creating networks that could coordinate commercial activities across the Mediterranean and beyond. These Italian traders brought sophisticated financial instruments and commercial techniques that enhanced the efficiency of maritime trade, while providing alternatives to the increasingly expensive overland routes. The development of new navigation technologies was making maritime routes increasingly competitive with traditional overland pathways. Improvements in ship design, including the development of larger vessels capable of carrying substantial cargoes, reduced the per-unit costs of sea transport for many types of goods. The refinement of celestial navigation techniques, combined with the creation of more accurate maps and charts, made ocean voyages more predictable and reliable than they had been in earlier periods. The spice trade, which had become increasingly important during the Mongol period, was particularly well suited to maritime transport. Spices from India and Southeast Asia could be shipped more economically by sea than by the traditional overland routes, especially as political fragmentation increased the number of taxation points and security concerns along the Central Asian pathways. The profits available from direct maritime access to spice-producing regions attracted increasing numbers of merchants and investors, creating competitive pressures that challenged the traditional dominance of overland trade. The Black Death pandemic that swept across Eurasia during the mid-14th century represented the most catastrophic disruption to transcontinental trade networks since the emergence of organized commerce. The disease, transmitted along the same routes that had carried prosperity and cultural exchange for centuries, devastated populations throughout the connected world and fundamentally altered the demographic and economic foundations that had sustained international commerce. Cities that had thrived as cosmopolitan trading centers found their populations decimated, their commercial infrastructure abandoned, and their cultural institutions destroyed. Kaffa, the Genoese trading post on the Black Sea that had served as a crucial link between European and Asian markets, became one of the most notorious vectors for the pandemic's spread. The city's role as a hub for transcontinental commerce meant that infected individuals and contaminated goods could rapidly reach destinations throughout the known world. The collapse of Kaffa's commercial activities symbolized the broader breakdown of the trading networks that had connected civilizations for over a millennium. The demographic catastrophe caused by the pandemic created labor shortages throughout the connected world that fundamentally altered economic relationships and commercial practices. Regions that had previously exported manufactured goods found themselves unable to maintain production levels, while areas that had depended on imported foodstuffs struggled to feed their remaining populations. These disruptions forced surviving communities to develop greater self-sufficiency while reducing their participation in transcontinental trade networks. The psychological impact of the pandemic was equally significant, as surviving populations often attributed the catastrophe to divine punishment for excessive contact with foreign peoples and cultures. This religious interpretation of the disaster led to increased suspicion of foreigners and foreign goods, creating cultural barriers to international commerce that persisted long after the immediate health crisis had passed. The cosmopolitan tolerance that had characterized many trading centers during the Mongol period gave way to more insular attitudes that made cross-cultural cooperation more difficult. The recovery from the pandemic proceeded at different rates in different regions, creating new patterns of commercial advantage and disadvantage that reshaped international trade relationships. Areas that maintained stable populations and effective governance, such as parts of the Islamic world and certain Chinese regions, found themselves in stronger competitive positions relative to territories that had suffered more severe demographic losses. These differential recovery rates contributed to the emergence of new commercial hierarchies that reflected changed demographic and economic realities rather than traditional patterns of trade. The Ottoman Empire, which emerged as a major power in Anatolia and the Balkans during the 14th and 15th centuries, represented one of the most successful efforts to harness the opportunities created by the fragmentation of previous trading systems. Ottoman rulers combined military expansion with sophisticated commercial policies that attracted merchants from across the known world to their territories. The empire's strategic position between Europe and Asia provided natural advantages for controlling transcontinental trade, while Ottoman administrative innovations created stable environments for commercial activities. The Ottoman approach to managing international commerce reflected lessons learned from previous empires about the importance of balancing state revenues with merchant prosperity. Ottoman officials imposed taxes on trade that were substantial enough to fund imperial administration and military activities, while remaining competitive with alternative routes that merchants might choose. This careful calibration of taxation policies helped attract commercial traffic to Ottoman-controlled routes, while generating the revenues necessary to maintain the security and infrastructure that merchants required. The development of Istanbul as the Ottoman capital created one of the most important commercial centers in the world, rivaling and eventually surpassing many of the traditional Silk Road cities in terms of volume and diversity of trade. The city's position on the Bosphorus provided natural advantages for controlling trade between Europe and Asia, while Ottoman investments in port facilities, warehouses, and commercial infrastructure enhanced its capacity to serve as a hub for international commerce. Ottoman commercial law incorporated elements from Islamic, Byzantine, and European legal traditions, creating hybrid systems that could accommodate the diverse requirements of international merchants operating under different cultural assumptions. The empire's legal flexibility proved particularly valuable for resolving disputes between traders from different backgrounds, while maintaining the consistency necessary for large-scale commercial operations. The Ming dynasty's establishment in China during the late 14th century brought new policies that would profoundly affect the eastern terminus of traditional Silk Road networks. The Ming rulers, reacting against the foreign domination that had characterized the Yuan period, adopted more restrictive approaches to international trade, that emphasized Chinese cultural superiority and reduced dependence on foreign goods and technologies. These policies, while strengthening Chinese political independence, reduced the incentives for transcontinental trade that had previously drawn merchants from across Eurasia to Chinese markets. The Ming tributary system required foreign merchants to participate in elaborate diplomatic ceremonies that acknowledged Chinese supremacy while limiting their commercial activities to designated ports and markets. This system generated revenues for the Chinese treasury while maintaining political control over foreign trade, but it also created costs and complications that made Chinese markets less attractive to international merchants compared to alternative destinations that offered greater commercial freedom. Chinese technological innovations during the Ming period continued to influence global development, but the empire's more restrictive trade policies limited the spread of these innovations compared to earlier periods when Chinese goods and knowledge had circulated freely throughout transcontinental networks. The Chinese development of advanced naval technologies, including improvements in shipbuilding and navigation, contributed to the expansion of maritime trade routes that increasingly bypassed the traditional overland Silk Road pathways. The rise of maritime exploration during the 15th century represented the beginning of a new era in international commerce that would eventually replace the overland networks that had connected civilizations for over a millennium. Portuguese explorers, seeking direct access to the spice-producing regions of Asia, developed sea routes around Africa that provided alternatives to the traditional overland pathways through Central Asia and the Middle East. Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to India in 1498 demonstrated the feasibility of maritime routes that could connect European and Asian markets without relying on the complex networks of intermediaries that had characterized overland trade. The Portuguese establishment of trading posts throughout the Indian Ocean created new commercial systems that operated independently of the traditional Silk Road networks, while providing more direct and potentially more profitable connections between producers and consumers. The Spanish discovery of the Americas during the same period created entirely new sources of wealth and new patterns of global trade that fundamentally altered the economic foundations of international commerce. The massive influx of silver from American mines provided new forms of currency that facilitated trade throughout the world while creating inflationary pressures that affected prices and commercial relationships across Eurasia. The emergence of Atlantic trade networks centered on American resources created competitive pressures for traditional Asian trade routes while providing European powers with new sources of wealth that could be invested in expanding their commercial and military capabilities. These developments marked the beginning of a shift in global economic power that would gradually marginalize the Central Asian routes that had been the backbone of transcontinental commerce for centuries. The technological innovations of the early modern period, including improvements in firearms, navigation, and shipbuilding, provided European powers with military and commercial advantages that enabled them to challenge traditional Asian commercial networks. European merchants and officials could now compete directly with Asian traders in their home markets, rather than relying on the complex chains of intermediaries that had previously been necessary for transcontinental commerce. The cultural and intellectual legacy of the Silk Road continued to influence global development, even as the physical routes declined in commercial importance. The scientific knowledge, artistic traditions, and technological innovations that had circulated along these networks for centuries had created foundations for further development that persisted long after the caravans stopped crossing the Central Asian deserts. The astronomical knowledge that had been preserved and transmitted through Silk Road networks influenced the development of navigation techniques that made oceanic exploration possible. Mathematical concepts that had traveled from India to China and the Islamic world provided foundations for the computational methods that enabled European merchants and explorers to plan and execute increasingly ambitious commercial and exploratory ventures. The linguistic legacy of transcontinental trade created communication networks that facilitated cultural exchange long after the commercial relationships that had originally fostered them had disappeared. Arabic, Persian, and Chinese continued to serve as languages of scholarly and commercial communication throughout much of Asia, while the hybrid languages that had developed in trading centers preserved vocabularies and concepts that reflected centuries of cross-cultural interaction. The architectural and artistic traditions that had emerged from Silk Road cultural exchange continued to influence creative development throughout Eurasia. The architectural styles that combined elements from multiple cultural traditions provided models for later builders and designers, while artistic techniques that had been shared across vast distances continued to enrich creative traditions long after their original contexts had disappeared. The agricultural legacy of the Silk Road included the widespread distribution of crops and farming techniques that had enhanced food production throughout the connected regions. Plants that had originally grown in specific geographical areas had been adapted to new environments through centuries of agricultural experimentation, creating more diverse and productive agricultural systems that could support larger populations and more complex economic activities. The medical knowledge that had circulated through Silk Road networks continued to influence healing practices throughout Asia and beyond. Techniques and remedies that had been developed in one cultural tradition had been adapted and refined through contact with other medical systems, creating hybrid approaches to healthcare that drew on the accumulated wisdom of multiple civilizations. The commercial techniques and financial instruments that had been developed to facilitate transcontinental trade provided foundations for the more sophisticated banking and credit systems that would emerge during the early modern period. The methods for managing risk, coordinating activities across vast distances, and resolving disputes between parties from different cultural backgrounds influenced the development of international commercial law and practice. The diplomatic traditions that had emerged from centuries of international trade continued to shape relationships between different powers long after the specific commercial arrangements that had originally fostered them had changed. The concepts of commercial treaties, trade agreements, and international arbitration had roots in the practical necessities of managing transcontinental commerce across cultural and political boundaries. As the 16th century progressed, the transformation from land-based to sea-based international commerce accelerated, fundamentally altering the geographic patterns of global trade and cultural exchange. The traditional Silk Road routes, which had connected East and West for over a millennium, gradually lost their commercial importance as maritime alternatives proved more efficient and profitable for most types of goods. The cities that had prospered as crucial links in the overland networks faced difficult transitions as commercial traffic shifted to new routes and centers. Some, like Istanbul, successfully adapted to serve new roles in maritime-based trading systems, while others, particularly those located in the interior regions of Central Asia, experienced prolonged economic decline as their traditional commercial functions became obsolete. Yet the legacy of the Silk Road extended far beyond its immediate commercial functions to encompass the very foundations of global civilization as we know it today. The cultural exchange, technological diffusion, and intellectual cross-pollination that had characterized these networks for centuries had created the interconnected world that would provide the foundation for all subsequent developments in international relations, commerce, and cultural development. The profound transformation that swept across Eurasia during the 16th and 17th centuries marked not merely the end of an era, but the metamorphosis of human civilization itself. The ancient pathways that had once pulsed with the lifeblood of transcontinental commerce were becoming whispered memories, their caravanserais standing empty beneath the endless Central Asian sky. Yet in this apparent decline lay the seeds of something far greater than what had come before. The Portuguese establishment of direct maritime routes to Asia represented more than simple commercial innovation. It embodied a fundamental shift in how human societies conceived of distance, possibility, and connection. Where once merchants had accepted the necessity of crossing hostile deserts and navigating complex political relationships with dozens of intermediary kingdoms, now a single ship could carry goods directly from producer to consumer across vast oceanic expanses. This transformation reduced not only costs and travel time, but also the cultural barriers that had previously made international commerce an exercise in diplomatic complexity. The Spanish conquest of the Americas introduced an entirely new element into the global economic equation. The massive quantities of silver extracted from Potosi and other mining centers created unprecedented levels of global liquidity, fundamentally altering price relationships and commercial patterns throughout the known world. Chinese merchants who had previously demanded silk, porcelain, or other manufactured goods in exchange for their products now accepted American silver as payment, creating direct monetary connections between civilizations that had never had direct contact. This silver-based global economy operated according to principles that differed fundamentally from the barter and credit systems that had characterized traditional Silk Road commerce. Where previous transcontinental trade had relied on complex chains of reciprocal relationships and cultural understanding, the new maritime networks could function through simple monetary exchange that transcended cultural and linguistic barriers. A Spanish merchant in Manila could purchase Chinese silk with American silver without requiring any deep understanding of Chinese culture or commercial customs. The Dutch emergence as a major maritime power during the early 17th century demonstrated how quickly new technologies and organizational innovations could reshape global commerce. The Dutch East India Company, with its sophisticated corporate structure and advanced shipbuilding techniques, could organize commercial expeditions on scales that dwarfed anything possible under traditional overland systems. A single Dutch fleet could carry more goods between Europe and Asia than hundreds of traditional camel caravans, while requiring far fewer personnel and facing significantly lower risks from bandits or political instability. The English entry into Asian trade through the East India Company created additional competitive pressures that further marginalized traditional overland routes. English merchants, building on Dutch innovations while adding their own organizational and financial improvements, could offer Asian goods in European markets at prices that made overland imports economically unviable. The traditional merchants who had operated along Central Asian routes found themselves unable to compete with maritime alternatives that could deliver the same goods more quickly and cheaply. The technological foundations that made this maritime revolution possible had themselves been influenced by centuries of knowledge exchange along the traditional Silk Road networks. The magnetic compass that enabled precise oceanic navigation had originated in China before spreading westward through the very trade routes it would eventually render obsolete. The astronomical knowledge that allowed European navigators to determine their position on the open ocean had been developed through centuries of scholarly exchange between Chinese, Islamic, and European astronomers who had met in the cosmopolitan trading centers of Central Asia. The irony was profound and poignant. The Silk Road had created the very conditions that would lead to its own obsolescence. The cultural exchange and technological diffusion that had characterized these networks for over a millennium had provided humanity with the knowledge and capabilities necessary to transcend the geographic limitations that had originally made the overland routes essential. The preservation and transmission of navigational techniques, shipbuilding methods, and astronomical knowledge through Silk Road cultural networks had created the foundation for the maritime revolution that would ultimately replace them. The social and cultural implications of this transformation extended far beyond immediate commercial considerations. The cosmopolitan trading centers that had flourished along the overland routes had served as laboratories for cultural innovation, places where individuals from vastly different backgrounds could meet, exchange ideas, and create new hybrid forms of art, literature, and scholarship. The decline of these centers represented not just economic change, but the loss of unique social environments that had fostered human creativity and cross-cultural understanding in ways that would be difficult to replicate. Samarkand, once the jewel of Central Asian commerce, experienced this transition as a gradual fading rather than sudden collapse. The city's magnificent architecture and sophisticated irrigation systems remained intact, but the international merchants who had once filled its bazaars with goods from across the known world appeared less frequently with each passing season. Local artisans who had specialized in producing goods for international markets found their skills less in demand, while the scholars and translators who had facilitated communication between different cultural groups discovered fewer opportunities to practice their cosmopolitan trades. The ancient pathways that once carried the dreams and ambitions of countless merchants now lie silent beneath the desert sands, their stories preserved only in the archaeological fragments and historical records that scholars continue to uncover. From Zhang Qian's first tentative steps into the unknown to the final caravans that crossed the Central Asian wastes, the Silk Road had woven together the tapestry of human civilization in ways that continue to shape our world today. The technologies we use, the foods we eat, the artistic traditions we cherish, and the very concept of global interconnectedness all bear the genetic fingerprints of those remarkable centuries when courage, curiosity, and commerce created the first truly international community. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that the spirit of the Silk Road lives on in every act of cultural exchange, every moment of cross-cultural understanding, and every bridge built between different worlds.